75 Years of The Assyrian. The 1940s did not end well for William Saroyan. He suffered greatly while in the army during World War II. He had had a marriage that fell apart at the end of the decade. Money issues began to flare up, and he'd had some of the most disastrous reviews of his career. He wasn't producing for the stage any longer, and wouldn't again for more than 7 years. He wasn't nearly the in-demand figure he had been at the end of the previous decades. It might be a remarkable thing that he released one of his most impressive collections in 1950, amidst a seeming sea of chaos. The Assyrian is that collection, and one of the stories holds an incredibly significant place in Saroyan's oeuvre. Originally written as 50-50, the collection comprised 11 stories, almost all written between 1946 and 1949. Let's start with the cover. Cover artists for Saroyan's 1940s U.S. books had been few. Don Freeman did his 3 biggest books, The Human Comedy, My Name is Aram, and The Saroyan Special, while Wallace Morgan illustrated the adventures of Wesley Jackson, and G.K. Lander did the art for Dear Baby. This time, no artist is credited with the cover design, but it is clear the idea was to tie the title to Assyrian imagery. In brown lettering against the green and white cover, the primary image, showing behind Saroyan's name in white text, is clearly inspired by the lion hunt reliefs from the Northwest Palace in Nineveh, Mesopotamia. This image, showing what is widely believed to be Ashurnapirel, or potentially his son, Shalmaneser III, on a lion hunt, which is one of the most famous of those held today at the British Museum. While there are minor differences between the cover version and that from the relief, it is clear that this image meant to give an impression of that connection. Entering into the book itself, we are greeted with a dedication to Lucintak. This is referencing his daughter, Lucy Saroyan, 1946 to 2003, who would have been about 3 when Saroyan wrote the dedication. Lucintak is the Armenian diminutive form of Lucy, which Saroyan often used to refer to his daughter, especially in letters. He dedicated several pieces to her over the years, both singularly and as part of groups, including Mama, I Love You. Saroyan, who had often proclaimed his fondness for prefaces, here participates in one of his most frequent. He writes an article about writing. Saroyan tells us that he had written these stories in hopes of making a lot of money. They were written, all 11 of them, in the hopes of being sold to magazines for big money, because a writer's gotta live. But only 2 of them got big money, though I'll never know why. The Cocktail Party, $5,000. The Pheasant Hunter, $3,000. These are clearly good amounts for stories in 1949 and 1950, but far from what stories sold to outlets such as the Saturday Evening Post or Esquire would have paid at the time. We're not certain where some of these stories first appeared. The Pheasant Hunter appeared in 1950 in World Review, a British publication. That would have been after the U.S. publication of the story in the Assyrian. It's unclear where the Cocktail Party first appeared, as we've only uncovered an anthology publication from 1956 that would clearly have paid well, but was far in the future from where Saroyan was writing his preface. He notes in the preface that he sold the Parsley Garden for $300, though that may be a matter of misremembering, because it sold to Harper's Bazaar, one of the better-paying markets in America. He mentions in a letter to his UK agent, Lawrence Pollinger, that he sold the story again to World Review, which paid him £46, after the editor realized it was such a short story. The preface for the books also goes into many of the areas that Saroyan had been exploring since his earliest publications. He talks about the ways that writers are both true and false to their voice and craft, about how writers should act, and about how a story and its character should, usually, be the ones to tell the writer what to write. The long essay was written, or at least completed, on October 31st, 1949, Saroyan's 41st birthday. Then we arrive at the titular story, The Assyrian. This novella-length piece is pure Saroyan in every way. Saroyan was nearly constantly traveling from 1949 through the end of the 1960s, and he often infuses his writing with the places he visited. Much of the story is set in Lisbon, Portugal, where Saroyan had visited in May of 1949. The ending of the story is one that isn't rare in Saroyan's writing, but is certainly not the expected thing. Our main character is told his heart will not likely be able to handle an airplane flight. He doesn't listen and instead gets on the flight. Saroyan ends it with him, up in the air, with no indication of either success or failure, life or death. He leaves it open-ended, but there is a clear statement he has followed, what he believes is his course, his rhythm as he calls it. Some would call it being stubborn, and others would see it as demanding to be the ruler of one's own destiny. Like the cat in Schrodinger's box, we cannot tell if he is alive or dead because we cannot observe what has happened after the final words on the page. He speaks of the Assyrian in his introduction. Only one story in this collection takes a real chance, The Assyrian. It is probably the least effective of the lot as art. The Assyrian dovetails nicely with another story of a stubborn protagonist and his refusal to accept the world as it is presented to him. The Parsley Garden is, without doubt, one of the most beautiful of all Saroyan's stories, and at the same time, one that tells you so much about how Saroyan saw the world he grew up in, and the one around us every day. It is a story of the immigrant experience, and specifically the second-generation immigrant experience. The story, later adapted by Saroyan's nephew Hank Saroyan for ABC TV, is one of Saroyan's most beloved and has been reprinted several times. It's a story that looks at how children are treated, about how standing up for one's principles, and in its final paragraph, recognizing that sometimes the system is what causes us to hate, and not the individuals who carry out the system's demands. The story is also not necessarily about Armenians, though it is unclear whether or not Al-Konrak, or Konraj, is Armenian or not. Though his last name is not traditionally Armenian, it might have been meant to be interpreted as Hungarian or otherwise Eastern European. Saroyan said of the story, "The Parsley Garden is made up, another item out of a miscellaneous past. Of its kind, it is a good story, and a man could spend his lifetime doing writing of this order." Of the stories in the collection, The Parsley Garden is the one that has remained the most relevant, having not only been adapted, but also included in many of the collections of Saroyan's work since his passing in 1981. Some consider it to be Saroyan's finest piece of writing from the 1940s onward. 3 stories originally appeared in the Armenian Review, a magazine Saroyan had been associated with since the inaugural issue in 1948. He notes that they are The Poet, The Theological Student, and The Foreigner. The Theological Student was the very first story published in the Armenian Review, though it is only the second piece of writing to appear in that magazine, the first being a poem by his cousin, Kachik Manassian, which appears on the page before his own. He points out that several of the stories in the collection he had been unable to place in magazines despite several attempts. Saroyan considers most of the stories to be safe, noting that The Poet at Home specifically is safe and cheerful, but notes that The Cocktail Party is not altogether safe either, but it is safe enough, I suppose. The Pheasant Hunter, Saroyan says, is a tour de force. It is a beautiful story, one that is a classic reprinted several times over the decades. It is another story of a young boy, as is the other story he calls a tour de force in the collection, The Third Day After Christmas. Saroyan's most memorable pieces often dealt with children, and these are very much stories that show how deftly Saroyan works with children as characters. The Assyrian was not Saroyan's best reviewed collection, though reviews often had a bite to them. William F. Mitchelfelder noted, "The maturity in the new Saroyan is more fed-upness than actual growth of the mind and spirit. then later added, "But the talent is still unmistakable." Well-known reviewer Jay Carmody was equally conflicted. No writer that vehement about the world and his personal relationship to it could be dull. Sorin is not, although he is his usual uneven self in The Assyrian. Like some of the best characters in his 2 or 3 good plays, he makes himself dramatic in that velvety, fuzzy fashion, what has always been his trademark for 2 decades. The Assyrians is sometimes forgotten among Sorin's collections. Not nearly as groundbreaking as The Daring Young Man of the Flying Trapeze and other stories, nor is it the massive trove of work that Inhale and Exhale was. But it is an excellent snapshot of a Saroyan that had transitioned more than once from short story wunderkind to celebrated playwright to novelist. Any collection with a story with the staying power of the Parsley Garden has to be considered significant, and one where Saroyan didn't see it as the best story of the bunch deserves even more attention and analysis.